In my last video, we got started on this topic, so if you missed that, be sure to go watch it after you watch this one, and today we're here to finish things up with part 2, as we are going through every single NBA team, identifying the worst contract currently on their payroll. These are contracts that have proven to be a bit of an overpay compared to the value that the players actually provide on the court, and the ramifications of these deals can sometimes be massive. If a player's return on investment does not match up to how much cap space they're taking up, it can become difficult to build a well-rounded roster because of the lack of funds left over. And while some teams we'll be discussing today will have lesser deals as their choice because they tend to spend their money more wisely than other teams mentioned, other teams are greatly affected by this still. Last video we ran through the teams in the Eastern Conference, which means today we are now finishing up with the teams in the Western Conference. Before we start though, it turns out a good amount of you watching right now aren't even subscribed to the channel, so if you enjoy the content, consider hitting the subscribe button, as not only does it help out a ton, but I'd also very much appreciate it. Now with that being said, let's begin. Going in alphabetical order, we'll start with the Dallas Mavericks, and the worst contract on their payroll for this season is Maxi Kleber, making $22 million over the next 2 years. Kleber's been unable to stay healthy for a few years now, and the injuries piling up have definitely affected his ability to impact games like he used to, because he's being paid like a fringe starter or a highly impactful bench player, but his production and efficiency continue to go down and down over time. Next is the Denver Nuggets, and their worst contract is Michael Porter Jr. making $114 million over the next 3 years. Porter Jr. was paid a max contract after a big season as an efficient volume shooter from 3, but a few years later it's seeming like that's all he'll ever be. He's not going to be a go-to scorer by any means, and greatly benefits from the playmaking of Jokic, which isn't a bad thing by any stretch, but the money they're paying him to not be a star player is hampering their ability to improve the roster around. Next is the Golden State Warriors, and their worst contract is Andrew Wiggins making $84 million over the next 3 years. Wiggins played a big role in the Warriors' last championship, but since then has fallen off of a cliff production-wise. Being paid that much to put up just 13 points on average efficiency at best is not going to cut it, and his struggles contributed to the Warriors missing the playoffs this past season. Next is the Houston Rockets, and their worst contract is Fred VanVleet making $86 million over the next 2 years. The Rockets, for the most part, have no quote-unquote bad contracts on their payroll, but VanVleet being on a max deal does stick out as a mismatch, as for comparison, he and Kyrie Irving were paid very similar contracts in the same offseason, and he's not quite on the same level to warrant that. Next is the Los Angeles Clippers, and their worst contract is Kawhi Leonard making $150 million over the next 3 years. Kawhi Leonard is a legend of the game and an all-time great, but injuries have derailed him a ton over the last few seasons, and when he's on the court, it's clear that he has begun to take a step backward. Owing him that much money for 3 more years is locking the Clippers into trying to build around him when he hasn't even played an entire playoff series since 2021. Next is the Los Angeles Lakers, and their worst contract is Gabe Vincent making $22 million over the next 2 years. Vincent had a breakout year with the Miami Heat, then got a payday in free agency from the Lakers, only for his first season there to be derailed by injury and poor play. It's hard to imagine Vincent returning on this investment, which hurt the Lakers' ability to spend in free agency this summer. Next is the Memphis Grizzlies, and their worst contract is Desmond Bane making $197 million over the next 5 years. Desmond Bane is a very good player who has outperformed his expectations since being drafted, but it's very difficult to imagine him being an all-star caliber max guy who can be a number 2 option on a contending team. With Morant out last year, he struggled mightily to lead this group to wins, and with all of that money tied up, they're locked into him being relied upon to that degree. Next is the Minnesota Timberwolves, and their worst contract is Jaden McDaniels making $133 million over the next 5 years. It's very easy to point at Rudy Gobert as the worst contract on the team, but McDaniels had one incredible year as an efficient 3-and-D guy, then immediately after being paid this big contract, reverted back to being inefficient as a shooter, with his scoring and shooting splits both regressing quite a bit, and that's a lot of money to have tied up into a defense-first guy that can't be relied upon to consistently score the basketball. Next is the New Orleans Saints, and their worst contract is Brandon Ingram making $36 million this upcoming season. I'll be honest, the Pelicans are another team without any really egregious deals, and Ingram's isn't even that bad either as it expires at the end of the season. But the reason why he's the pick by default is that the team has been actively trying to trade him this summer, but have been unable to do so, and the contract probably plays a part in that. Next is the Oklahoma City Thunder, and their worst contract is Isaiah Hartenstein making $87 million over the next 3 years. The Thunder have been so good with their money lately that they could afford to overpay Hartenstein to lure him away from the Knicks this year in free agency, so while on paper this may be an overvaluation for someone who had just 1 season of experience as a starting center, it won't really be hurting the team nearly as much. Next is the Phoenix Suns, and their worst contract is Bradley Beal making $171 million over the next 3 years. Beal's contract may be the worst in the entire NBA and is actively holding the Suns back from being able to round out the rest of their roster, while also having a no-trade clause included so he gets to determine when and if he gets moved in any trade deals. Next is the Portland Trail Blazers, and their worst contract is DeAndre Ayton making $70 million over the next 2 years. Ayton was one of the biggest selling points in the Damian Lillard trade, but he continues to be disappointingly mediocre as a former #1 overall pick, and the Blazers just drafted his potential replacement, making it clear that he may not be part of their long-term plans. Next is the Sacramento Kings, and their worst contract is Kevin Huerter making $35 million over the next 2 years. The Kings just signed backup Malik Monk to an even bigger contract extension, which tells you what they think about Huerter's future with the team. Huerter is a 10-point scoring average shooter whose struggles on defense are just not always worth it. Next is the San Antonio Spurs, and their worst contract is Zach Collins making $35 million over the next 2 years. The Spurs extended Collins' contract, expecting him to be able to pair with Victor Wembanyama in the same starting frontcourt, but it became very clear early on that those two as a duo did not work out well, and now they're paying a starter's salary for Collins to be a backup who plays sparingly. And finally, the last team up is the Utah Jazz, and their worst contract is John Collins making $53 million over the next 2 years. John Collins had a season putting up 20 points and 10 rebounds per game back in 2020 and has steadily regressed every year since. The Jazz traded for him hoping to tap back into that potential, but it didn't really go anywhere, and he's not the best fit to play next to Lauri Markkanen either, so he is the choice here. And with that being said, that's all I have for you today. Make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment down below what you think the worst contracts in the NBA are right now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time.